Five, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right, we're live. Hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa, ni hao, jambo, marhaba. It's time for the Armist Inquisition yet again, episode 238 on Sunday, the 3rd of July, 2022. I'm Amish Phil.
I'm Amish Ben.
And I'm Amish Matt.
And tonight our very special guest is Maria Wheatley. How you doing, Maria?
Very well. Thank you for having me on the show. And it's great to be here. Thanks.
You're more than welcome. I was saying just before we started, and I should say up front, thanks to Noble from CFR for help setting this up, because I heard you on his podcast. He split it up into like 2 sections, and you were talking about megaliths and ancient societies, lost civilizations, and ancient archaeology and all the rest of it. And I thought, crikey, this is well up our street. So thanks so much for joining us.
It's good.
I think a good place to start, maybe for people who aren't familiar with you, is maybe just tell us a bit about yourself and what you do.
Yes, well, I'm Maria, and I'm a second-generation dowser. I followed in the footsteps of my late father, and I've done my own research into megaliths and made some great discoveries, such as the elongated skulls of Stonehenge. I look at the earth energy patterns, the design canons worldwide, from the pyramids to Malta to places like Sardinia, in search of what the ancients were really doing with their sites and what we've inherited today, in effect.
Right. So, I mean, I guess one of your main focuses is the ancient sites in the UK.
Yes, very much so, and Egypt. I mean, the ancient sites in the UK, we're spoiled for choice because we have over 1,000 surviving stone circles alone in the ancient UK. So we're very blessed to some regards.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you can't move for stone circles around these islands, can you?
Yes, we have places like Stonehenge, Callanish, Orkney, for example, and in Ireland, we have numerous sacred sites. And I've studied, all of the sites, the major sites around the British Isles.
Have you ever been to Castle Rigg Stone Circle? That's near us, up in the lakes.
Many times. I mean, Castle Rigg is amazing. It's got such a beautiful backdrop of mountains, and it's quite a good reconstruction as well. And the largest stone, which is at the kind of far end, as it were, that casts a shadow 2 miles long at the summer solstice. And there's numerous ancient sites sited along that shadow line. So at Castle Rigg, it was about shadow lines and the placement of stones as well. And not far away, you have Swinside in Cumbria, which is the most complete stone circle in the British Isles, and it has 55 stones in situ. That's unprecedented. And when I take people to Swinside, as you walk into the avenue, because the thing about the Cumbrian stone circles where you are, you have like 4 stones as an entrance. You don't have major megalithic avenues like at Avebury and Stonehenge. You have portal entrances, and as you walk into Swinside, you can actually feel the heat pouring off the stones if you enter it correctly. It's astonishing, very powerful.
Wow. Is there any kind of idea how old that is at Swinside, that formation?
They're older than according to Orthodox archaeology and dating, the Cumbrian stone circles, as indeed Orkney and other places in Scotland, are older than Stonehenge and Avebury. So you're looking at, according to the archaeologist Aubrey Burl, to around 3,200, 3,100 BC.
Wow.
Amazing.
And so, I mean, what do we know about the people who built these sites? Because as far as I understand it, and I'm only going off sort of like what I know about the standard model, is that the Celts didn't arrive till maybe 1000 BC, around that sort of area. So, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong. So, who do we know anything about the people who were building these sites? You know, like 2 millennia before that.
Yes, we do, because there's been a lot of archaeological excavations of settlements. For example, at Stonehenge nearby, you have a settlement called Durrington Walls. And once you have a settlement, you can find out a little bit more about the people, what they were eating, what they were drinking, and what they were doing to a certain degree, really. And certainly around the Stonehenge environs, people were coming from all over the continent. You have evidence from amber coming from Estonia, jet coming from Whitby Bay in North Yorkshire, and beads from Egypt. So these were cosmopolitan centers where people were coming together at certain times of the solar year to celebrate. And a lot of people suggest that at Stonehenge, for example, it was a healing location, a healing site, which has been documented ever since the 12th century, when Geoffrey of Monmouth said every single stone of Stonehenge has healing virtue.
Wow. Yeah, he was a bit of a character, that Geoffrey of Monmouth, and I remember reading a book a few years ago, and it was written by 2 Welsh guys who were looking into the story of King Arthur and going back through
Alan Wilson.
I think it was, yeah, and they were using like stories from the Welsh bards and the old Welsh language to try and narrow bits of the story down. It was absolutely fascinating, and I think they relied quite heavily on I think a lot of people are relying heavily on Geoffrey of Monmouth, because there weren't many people like him who were documenting all this stuff.
No, just preceding him slightly was William of Malmesbury. He documented a Stonehenge rather in the 12th century as well. And then after that time, it isn't really until the 1600s that you've got good documentation of archaeological practices at places like Stonehenge by Inigo Jones and the Duke of Buckingham. So there's a big gap, if you see what I mean, between the 12th century and indeed the 1600s.
You mentioned just a minute ago about amber. And amber coming from, I think it was the Black Sea area. Is this are they called faience beads or something like that?
No, their faience beads are absolutely stunning. They're a kind of piercing blue, striking colour, which are more Mediterranean and Egyptian. So that's where they come from. The amber came from the Estonian area, and they made them into these beautiful breastplates. So if you imagine pieces of amber in a kind of rectangular shape, 7 inches long by 2 inches wide, and the priesthood at Stonehenge would wear these over their breasts like priests throughout the world. That would be very, very stunning looking. And the thing about amber and the thing about jet as well, it has a kind of electrical property. Things can stick to it. It looks quite magical. You know, a bit like when you comb your hair with a nylon comb, it will stick up. Amber has those properties as well, so you can attract different substances towards it. But more than that, the priesthood around Yorkshire and indeed around Stonehenge would burn intoxicating opiates and swing them like church censors, like Catholic priests would do, and they would lead people into Stonehenge like that, because you've got numerous what's called incense bowls that have been found throughout the British Isles. So there was a kind of very altered state of consciousness going on within these stone circles in the mid-Bronze Age.
Did you say opium?
Yes, that has been analysed through what's called the incense pot, when they thought it was just going to be aromatic flavoured, herbs, and it turned out it wasn't. It was opiates, which have been grown in the Mediterranean since about 3000 BC.
Right. So did they manage to trace where that opium could have come from then?
Exactly, that's what they've done, and they realise now, that when they found these incense pots in Bronze Age burials, especially the mid-Bronze Age, which is around 1950 BC, and they analysed the substances, they realised that these were very strong opiates, and possibly, and the jury's out on that, whether it was cannabis as well. And certainly they were brewing alcohol to a strong regard as well. And the flavored meat that they really liked was young pork fed on honey, very sweet meat.
Wow. I think we sort of forget just how connected things were in the Bronze Age. Whether it was tin from Cornwall, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, it was a very interconnected world. And I guess the people who built Stonehenge, would that civilization have been around at that time, at the sort of the end of the Bronze? Was maybe the Bronze Age collapse what finished off the megalith builders?
Bronze Age collapse, according to Orthodox archaeology, was 1500 BC. There were no other stone circles built after that, but that was really due to a lot of different political and social circumstances that were happening at that time. So that's when the kind of megalithic building phase ended. But you see, if you go back to its early roots and you go to somewhere like Avebury or Stonehenge, it's what's called a composite monument. It's not built in one phase. So you will get phase one of Avebury, which is the very large stones like the cove stones and the obelisk stone, and their stone settings. And then 500 years passed, and then the stone circles were built around those stone settings. And then up to 300, 400 years after that, avenues were built. And when people go to these ancient sites, they think they were all built at the same time. And they look around the ancient landscape and see round barrows and long barrows, and they all think they're contemporary, but they're not. There's 1,000 years in between each culture that actually added to these sites. And same at Stonehenge. You have Stonehenge phase 1, Stonehenge phase 2, Stonehenge phase 3 and 4. And they're all kind of protracted over a long period of time, as much as 1,200 years.
Yeah, I think the bluestones at Stonehenge were a later addition in phase 3 or phase 4 or something. They weren't there to start with. What amazes me is the span of time you're talking about, because for a certain site to stay in, presumably regular usage for over 1,000 years. I mean, can we think of modern equivalents to that? It suggests a level of stability in the society at the time.
Well, I actually don't think that, if I may say so, because if we go back to the bluestones were the first to be introduced into Stonehenge phase 1, 86. They had 56 bluestones in phase 1, in a large circle at Stonehenge, and another 27, possibly 30, at a place called Blue Stonehenge. And that was built by one particular culture. They were the Neolithic people, the ancient Britons of this isle. And they had longer skulls than what we have, darker skin than what we have, and they were very, very short people. We know this because when you go to the contemporary monuments, such as the long barrows, they are left behind, obviously, in burial deposits, their skulls and their femur bones. And once you have a femur bone, you can get an estimated height. So the men of the Neolithic that actually put up the heaviest stones were only about 5'4", and the women were about 4 feet 8. And then in 2500 BC, you have an immigration wave from Europe called the beaker culture. And the beaker culture were much taller, and they adopted some of the ancient sites and added to them. So you're looking at two different civilizations over a long period of time. And like I say, you can start to really analyze these two different cultures by burial deposits. For example, only long-skulled people were buried in long barrows, and only round-skulled people were buried in round barrows. So these are the two different cultures that were interacting and working within the ancient landscape, building monuments, changing the existing monuments within a prehistoric timeline.
Now, I've never heard about long skulls found at Stonehenge. Tell us about them.
Well, it was in 2015 that I discovered the first elongated skulled woman, actually, in the Stonehenge environs. And I kind of traced her down to Cambridge University, photographed her for, physical evidence. And their long skulls were not like the paracas skulls of Peru, which are kind of cone heads going up. If you imagine they're more long skulled this way. And they were the kind of Neolithic people of that time. So they were, like I said, they tended to be smaller, they had long skulls, and they were placed into the Neolithic long barrows. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, the Europeans, like us in a way, the Europeans came into these isles in 2500 BC and really changed it. ADNA, meaning ancient DNA, has been analyzed from, hundreds of skulls and different parts of the human anatomy. And it was discovered that between the arrival of the beaker culture, these two cultures did not mix for 500 years, but by around 2480 BC, the ancient DNA of the Neolithic had been eradicated. Britain had been transformed. And anthropologists and most modern-day archaeologists agree with that, like Tom Booth and Dr. Selina Brace and Ian Barnes. They've been doing a lot of DNA studies. So we know that the ancient Britons were responsible for building the monuments, and the beaker culture came after and adapted and modified the monuments.
Wow. The elongated skulls at Stonehenge, do we know if these were like a binding, like an artificially, what they do with is it feet binding in China, is it? Or whether it was like a natural, just like a genetic thing, or do we know?
That's a really good question, and yes, it's a bit of both actually. The ruling elite extended their naturally long skulls and made them longer, whereas the kind of lesser people, the non-rulers, if you will, they didn't, and they had long skulls but not as long. So there was a definite kind of elite lineage within Stonehenge, and it was only the rulers that went into the long barrows. There were flat graves, like what I end up in 6 feet under, so to speak, flat graves that more common people, so to speak, would go into the flat graves. So there was a hierarchy even in the Neolithic period.
And do you think that hierarchy would have been related to like a priestly class? Or like a ruling monarchy type or chieftain sort of class?
I think it was a priestly class, because when you start to look at some of the artifacts that were placed into the barrows as well, you get things like antlers, and you get small kind of stones that would have meant something to these people. And again, more of a crude style of incense pot and pyrite to make fires. These are all luxury goods in the Neolithic that would have meant that you were a priestly class. I mean, we must remember that, in the ancient world, even by the Iron Age from 750 BC to 1000 BC thereafter, the priestly caste was was the ruling elite and kingship at the same time. The two were very closely entwined. And even in ancient Egypt, the two are entwined. So I think in ancient Britain, it was definitely a priestly caste. And by the time of, 1950 BC, known as Wessex Stage 3 in the archaeological record, the priestly caste were magnificent looking. They wore gold. They had gold trestles in their hair. They wore very finely white silky clothing, which was made from nettle and even could be a kind of eco-friendly material for our future, because it's really kind of strong and robust. So they looked the part.
That's a great point. I guess the separation of church and state is quite a recent development, really, for our sort of civilization, our culture, in that, yeah, you're right, they were probably one and the same for most of human history. Is this something to do with, one of the things that I tend to think about is when I think about stone circles and the links with agriculture and having that knowledge of being able to predict the seasons with accuracy and when's the best time to plant and when to harvest and all that, and the sort of the power that gives you, that knowledge, if you like, that the people working the land maybe don't have. Is this part of the reason why this evolved into like a priestly class and then a kingly class, this sort of knowledge of the seasons and how to build the monuments?
Exactly. I mean, agriculture is entwined to daily life in the ancient world. And at Stonehenge, phase 1, with the 56 blue stones, as in 1960s Gerald Hawkins and Sir Fred Hoyle pointed out, it's an eclipse predicting computer. So now you can predict things like, blood red moons and the like. But in my, forthcoming book, A Secret History of Stonehenge, I point out that it's not just the timing of the season. I think that the ancients could utilize particular earth energy cycles, place the seed within that cycle, and in certain agricultural trials that I have been doing, the seed grows much faster and much straighter. And I think what the ancients knew, not only where to place a monument, which is at an earth energy nexus point of ley lines, earth currents, deep waters, magnetism, and various other things. When it came to growing agriculture, they knew where to plant as well. And even if you kind of look to what's called lynchets, they can be in the most inhospitable place, and yet they produced a harvest. In ancient Greek terms, with their chroniclers and how they were writing about the ancient Britons, they all said the same thing. Britain had 2 harvests per year, and we could supply ancient Europe. And I think it's like when you come to an ancient site, it's location, because you have to find all the criteria to make it a very powerful center with electromagnetic energies and, like I just mentioned, layers and earth currents. And when it come to growing the crops, they could tell areas that were not going to produce good foods. And so they would mark that out in the ancient landscape as well. Basically, they were living in harmony with nature. They knew about Gaia's good earth energies and what's called geopathic stress, which is her more negative earth energies.
This reminds me of something that came up when we had Brian Forster on. And it was
Brian.
Yeah, he's great. He's due back, actually. We need to get onto him.
He said
he would come back in the summer. But just towards the end, it was like just a throwaway at the end. But he mentioned, because something about the correlation of the different sites in Central and Southern America. And he briefly mentioned something about earth energies and lines.
Yes.
So
yeah. Brian knows of my work, and Brian knows I'm going to be bringing this out. Brian is going to be forwarding my next book, which has this chapter in it. So yes, Brian, you see, he's the elongated skulls of paracas, and I'm the elongated stones of Stonehenge. And I had the great pleasure of taking Brian around Stonehenge. He chose me as his guide. And so I was supposed to have been doing a tour with him in ancient Egypt actually in March, but Brian had COVID and I got COVID, and so it was a non-starter. But nonetheless, I have been looking into the earth energy patterns that can promote good harvests. And the thing is, the ancients were knowing where to place them at a particular cycle within the sun and within the moon to enhance it. And that's the key. They were working with the natural cycle. Now, if you're working with a natural cycle and you can produce better food, 2 harvests per year, the little known fact is that in the 1950s, with the advent of fertilizers, for example, that was when the fertilizers really kicked off. It was in the 1950s. Prior to that, the harvest yield of the Iron Age people could not be beaten. It was only because of fertilizers. So that is telling you that the ancients knew all about agriculture far, far better than the modern mindset.
Yeah, well, we're so separated from it now, aren't we? We just go to this place called a supermarket and it's all there for you. You just take your pick. All these things that don't even grow anywhere near you. They've come from halfway across the world, you know, like tangerines and stuff and bananas. It's like I'm with you on the sort of trying to live sustainably, eat food that grows seasonally and locally. And yeah, I do worry about this sort of GMO stuff and you know, sort of, I don't know, it's natural is best, I guess.
I don't think we need it. I think if we adopt the ancient templates, because it was when I was studying with Lisa Brown at Oxford that I realized that the ancients were repeating a particular pattern all across, especially the Southwest, which is still the agricultural hub. You know, it really is. And they made this kind of template, and it was repeated and repeated and repeated throughout the Southwest. So when you have a template in agriculture, when you have a template of what makes a sacred site a holiest of holies, you start to repeat it because it works. So for example, one of the templates of an ancient site is a very, very deep aquifer. Now, you find a deep aquifer, whether it's beneath Stonehenge, the pyramids of Egypt at Giza, or in Mexico. That's one of the design canons that the ancients were aware of. Now, I today detect those through the medium of dowsing. We use a dowsing rod, and I'm quite sensitive to those energies anyway. But I actually would be challenging even that. Maybe our ancient ancestors, because of their long skulls, which have a bigger brain capacity, we could say that they were highly intelligent. But could it be on a metaphysical level that they also had greater spirituality? And when I've done some tests on standing stones that have a hertz frequency that's been emitted by the standing stone, it often is just under the audible hearing of around 20 hertz. We hear at 20 hertz. So if you have these lower hertz frequencies coming out of the stones and the ground, could they have heard that? Could the ancients have had a completely different sensory perception of an ancient site than we do today? I think is probable.
Yeah. So explain, you use the sort of dowsing methods to find aquifers. This is something I know nothing about, other than I've seen someone on TV with like 2 rods like this and then they cross. Is that right? Am I in the picture?
Yeah, I mean, that's old school. Yes. I mean, they would be, you
have a laptop, do you? For dowsing?
No, I don't have a laptop. I wish I did. That would be a good thing. I kind of, professional dowsers these days just use 1 rod because you use directional dowsing. And if you've got 1 rod poking ahead like that, as it were, and you say, show me the direction of the nearest aquifer, it's going to go like that. And then you follow it. It's called tracking. And then the rod will come towards you, and that's found. If you've got 2 rods, you can't really do directional dowsing, if you see what I mean. You're just finding things, but maybe not with the intent of finding it. You're just walking around and the rods cross. A good master dowser knows and can interpret the energy they find in the land through the pattern it emits. So, for example, deep water emits a spiral pattern. Another type of water has 3 wavy lines, like the old-fashioned symbol of water. Then you get another concentric circles of energy, and all of these can be interpreted through the medium of dowsing. So, yeah, I kind of like the idea of having this laptop. Are you guys going to make me the kind of future dowsing or something?
You know,
I'll do it.
I'm thinking, like, is there like a spiritual sensitivity element to all this? Have you always had this sort of in your life, had this sort of more heightened sensitivity to these sorts of things than the average Joe on the street?
I think we all have it, because when I take people to sites like Avebury or Stonehenge, people just sense it. You know, it's a bit like if you went into a room and people had been arguing and you say that old-fashioned saying, you can cut the air with a knife. Yeah. And now if you put that to another angle and saying, you know, there's positive energy here, people sense that. And the ancients were very clever in how they laid out their monuments. For example, whether you go to a gigantic temple like Karnak in Egypt, or whether you go to Avebury or Stonehenge in Wiltshire, for example, there's always one area, or standing stone in the case of a stone circle, where it emits a lot of negative ions coming out of the ground. And if you stand in that area, it's almost like your whole auric field, your whole being becomes cleansed before you enter the monument, so you don't take your emotional baggage with you. And I got taught this by some Catholic dowsers that were doused in North Italy, and said this is how the priesthood interacts with the Catholic Church. So they're interacting with the Catholic Church in a pagan manner. And then when I started to look into the design canons of ancient sites, I thought, well, I found the same now at Avebury and Stonehenge and Karnak. So I think we have this inbuilt sensitivity. You don't have to have been around Avebury for half your life like me. You really don't. You can just step into the monument. For example, I was with two people at the weekend, put them into an environment, and they instantly said, I feel calm. You know, you put them somewhere else and they may say, I feel something else there. So I think it's for everybody and anyone.
I don't know. Maybe my pineal gland's just covered in crusty fluoride, and that's my problem. I can't have any, like, I haven't had any paranormal experience. All right, I haven't been looking for them, but I haven't had any paranormal experiences.
No.
Well, I would say hang out in Wiltshire and then you'll have one.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, Maria, is I'm fascinated with the question of Atlantis and a lost civilization, and the question of diffusion of technology. And, you know, our written record or our story of civilization goes back to Sumer in Egypt at 4000 BC, whatever, started writing, and that there might have been something before that, and that we are like the inheritors of something that went before and fell. What's all your sort of learning and research? What's your opinion on that sort of stuff?
Yeah, well, if we look to some ancient maps like Pliny the Elder, he actually puts Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, although that Atlantis is in many different places for many different people. But if we say, you know, it was in Atlantis, and we look to what Plato said in the description of the metropolis, the city there, it's a ringed city, you know, it's a ringed environment. And again, when we look to different types of earth energy, you have these massive rings. And I think Atlantis was the first to utilize earth energy concentric circles. They're actually called primary halos, if you want to use a technical term. And it was pointed out to me some years ago that if indeed it was in Atlantis, that ancient continent, and it went down in a day, as Plato described, and you were a survivor and you were going across the Atlantic, the first place you would land at is Sligo Bay in Ireland. And when we look to the dating of these monuments in Sligo, they are far, far older than Cumbria, than Stonehenge, than Avebury. They're the most ancient. So some ancient technology came to Sligo thousands of years before the stone circles were built in the south of England, which are famous.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense, does it? With the standard model of history, why would people go all the way out of, you know, the pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, and then go up to that coast of Ireland? Why wouldn't they go? Why wouldn't it move overland? You know, throughout Europe like that. It's a quandary.
Exactly. It's not just coming from the east to the west. It's coming the other way as well, and there's the evidence for that. So you have to question that whole model and saying it's not as simple as everybody is walking and migrating one way. That just did not happen in the ancient world. And the archaeological evidence is there to say so.
What do you make of, because Plato in his account in Timaeus and Critias talks about the ancient Athenians being at war with the Atlanteans and defeating them. Do you think that's sort of Plato doing a bit of Greek PR back in the day, or do you think there was maybe a conflict, like these guys were in the middle of the Atlantic dominating, and they came across and the Athenians defeated them, the forebears of the Athenians?
I think Plato was using his own knowledge that was disposable to him at any one point in time. So you tend to interpret things for your own cultural identity. And a lot of people do that with ancient sites today. They project what they think is on that. And I think Plato was projecting that, maybe because he got the whole story from, an Egyptian, so to speak. Maybe he was just reinterpreting it through what he knew about, ancient Greece. And it could have been another type of war. I think probably war did occur, or there was some kind of conflict, but whether it was the ancient Greeks or not is totally debatable.
Yeah. The thing that interests me particularly with Atlantis is it plays into the sort of universal flood myth that we hear about as well, whether it be Epic of Gilgamesh or Noah, or anywhere around the world you want to go, there always seems to be some sort of flood myth. Do you think that maybe that's a cultural echo, a cultural memory of what happened with a lost civilization?
Yes, it could indeed be. And it could also be, the record in the Younger Dryas period, where in about, 12,000 years ago, there was records of a big flood then that could have been a part of the whole Atlantean idea. I mean, also, I think, it's not just Atlantis. It's not just going to be Lemuria. There's going to be lots of long-lost civilizations if at 12,000 years ago that the sea levels rose dramatically. So maybe we were looking to one place like Atlantis, and there's going to be lots of other lost continents as well. We know from separating from the European mainland 6,000 years ago, that's all, we were part of Europe then. And we now have, obviously the sea, the channel there separating us. But we know there's a whole continent called Doggerland there that's probably got ancient civilizations and evidence for that, should the archaeology be able to be extracted from beneath the seas. I think there's lots of lost continents.
Yeah. You wonder how many times we've had the Great Reset. Not Uncle Klaus's Great Reset, but like a natural conflagration or some sort of massive civilization reboot over our history, because, like Graham Hancock says, things just keep getting older, and our sort of idea of how old our species goes back seems to be going back 50,000 years every decade. And you just think, well, what were people just sitting on their hands for 150,000 years doing nothing before they decided to invent agriculture? It's like, it doesn't make sense. That's why I wonder if there's maybe multiple times that we've got to a certain stage and then been sent back to the Stone Age, as the saying goes.
Yeah, I mean, even when we look to timing in this country and you look beneath the Neolithic long barrows 5,500 years ago, there's evidence for Mesolithic ploughing. All archaeologists know that, but we are told the Mesolithic were hunter-gatherers. That's simply not true. There's the evidence in the landscape for that. And we've had recent resets as well. I mean, the end of the megalithic period and the start of the Iron Age, for example, and the rise of the Druids, if you will, had suffered traumatic climate change. Bang, overnight. the climate plummeted by a degree. And that's really serious. And that was literally overnight. And that's, again, in the archaeological record, because you have peat bogs suddenly swamping certain areas. And so I think our ancestors went through huge climatic changes with the Younger Dryas, 12,000 years ago. But then also around about, 1000 BC as well, things were beginning to change because of the climate. And, here we are today, listening to the same mantra of our own culture that there's climate change going on, some may say or disagree with today.
Yeah, I just saw today Eric Klein's update sequel to 1177 BC is just being sent off now to the editors or printers or whatever. And in his updated version, he talks a lot about climate problems that were happening then. And it's nothing,
Absolutely. I mean, it's all in the record, and it's been known for quite some time, to be fair.
I think we just have this picture that things just always stay the same in our modern sort of viewpoint. Nothing ever changes. It's just, I think, when you wake up tomorrow, you'll have the same day that you had yesterday, and people don't know about the Roman warm period or the medieval warm period or the Little Ice Age in the 17th, 18th century. They just think things will just keep going. Don't worry about it. And we're sort of, it's a bit hubristic.
I mean, exactly. And, part of me thinks it's like a repeat until humanity learns from a certain situation. It goes on to a repeat, a bit like, in past lives and in regression until you learn the actual soul lesson. It gets repeated and it's repeated, and possibly there's something wrapped up in humanity in that regard. But what we certainly do know is when the climate plummeted by a degree, you could no longer grow food on the lowlands. And so everybody headed for the hills. And that's why you had the Druid hill forts, although they're being recategorized today and called ceremonial hill centers and not hill forts. That was only when the Romans came and they were refortifying them. So you've got, again, different cultural changes over a different period of time. But when you do have these big events that happen, it seems that the whole religious spirituality of the people changes. It certainly did between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, for example.
How do you mean? What was the big change spiritually in that time period?
Well, you no longer worship at a stone circle, for example. You would then go to a much higher ground, on elevated ground, to the top of a hill that was, made into earthworks on the top. And in the chalk landscape, they would have been crowning the hilltops in chalk white. It would look quite spectacular. And they would create a different type of shrine monument than would have been at the standing stone below. So everything changed with it's like suddenly saying, in this moment in time, we're no longer going to have churches, we're no longer going to do it like this, we're going to do it like this. It was a huge leap and change, and that hasn't happened since that era, apart from the advent of Christianity.
Wow, that's cool. That's just got me thinking about the Bible when it keeps saying, talking about the high places, like all the temples, like the Babylonian temples and the Temple of Judah, they're always at high places. And that's an interesting idea, that maybe they weren't always at high places. There was a reason for this.
It was, and in the British Isles at least, and France alike, actually, ancient Gaul, as recorded by Caesar, they did head for the hills and for high ground. It was practical because Birmingham was a swamp, Manchester was very swampy, the lands around Wiltshire became waterlogged. You couldn't do anything.
Wow. It's fascinating. I don't know where to go. There's just so much. It's like, I don't know whether to go to Templars or not. I love
always want
that.
to go to Templars.
All we
No.
could do, we can.
I love the Knights Templars. I mean, right, let me get your opinion on this. Knights Templars and Freemasonry. Is there a link or is there not a link?
Well, I come from decoding earth energies. That's my kind of real understanding in the ancient world, as well as skulls. And the way I see it is that at one time you had the Neolithic and the Bronze Age people, and the circle meant everything to them, everything. And the circle would be used in terms of earth energy. They'd look for circular earth energy patterns, and they placed the standing stones on the circles, and hence a stone circle, of course. And then when time went on, for example, with the Druids, they would look for another type of energy to make it sacred, the holiest of holies. And when it came to the Templars, for example, and the Masons that were constructing the churches at that time, they wouldn't look for the circle. That was no longer appropriate for their religious stance. They look for earth currents forming a cross in the land, like, crossing literally like that, one current going one way, maybe a bit of an angle going the other way, the geocross in the land. And they build and construct their churches above that, because you can have all of the sacred geometry in the world that you like, all of the mathematics that are pure and just, with beautiful ratios and harmonics. But if you don't have the living earth energies beneath the ground reflecting that, it won't have the life force contained within a church. So we went from the circle to the geocross in the landscape with the Templars and the Masons. That was their design canon, and everything then in a church became a huge meaning to a completely different culture when you compare it to the stone circles. The windows would be placed on a particular type of earth current, and the font, for example, and the communion rail, and you'd have different types of grid systems integrated into a church of the early medieval period.
I'm guessing, like, I read a book once by Fulcanelli on Chartres Cathedral, and this seemed to be one of the places in France that sort of encoded loads of this information and these sorts of principles. Is this sort of unique to a certain period of building where they were really in tune with this sort of technique, this knowledge?
Chartres Cathedral, Oxford University, and Winchester, the first minster of Christianity, all have one thing in common. They were a Druid core, C-O-R, and that means college. And so all of these buildings were preceding that Christian construct, were a Druid core. And that was the first foundation for a lot of the Christian churches. And that's quite interesting. I mean, even like I said, Oxford University was an ancient core. And Glastonbury had one nearby, because, the Druids studied for up to 20 years to be a learned, fully fledged Druid.
Okay, only 19 years, 9 months and 9 days left for me then. I have to get some. I need to get some robes. Yeah, you're halfway there with your beard, Ben.
I sent off for the first degree. It never came.
They never came. They wouldn't even let you in the first degree. Shocking. I mean, the way I understand it, one of the last sort of holdouts for the Druids was Anglesey. Is that right?
That's correct. There was a lot of the Druids were forced up to Anglesey, which again has many Neolithic and Bronze Age sites of spectacular Anglesey, and they were kind of pushed up there. But then there was like a crossover, really, of Druidry to Christianity, and they were called the Chaldees. And the Chaldee means certain stranger, and it's thought that the certain strangers were those from the Middle East that came over, the disciples of Jesus, is muted, came to Glastonbury, for example, and the Chaldees learned from the Druids. So I think one of the first churches and several minsters that were created by the Chaldees were in fact under the Druid administration and consultation at that time.
Wow. What about the man himself and his uncle Joseph of Arimathea? Do you think he may have made it here?
Joseph of Arimathea definitely made it here. He was a tin trader, for sure. But you see, when you look at the sacred geometry of the first church built, allegedly, under the direction of Joseph of Arimathea, well, it's the same sacred geometry as Stonehenge. So now you're saying that there was a Druid core near Stonehenge at Amesbury, according to the Welsh triads, at least. And so I think Joseph of Arimathea was learning from those that knew about the sacred geometry of Stonehenge, because the two are identical, as discovered by, famous authors like John Michell, and before preceding him, Frederick Blythe Bond, that excavated Glastonbury Abbey and unearthed many, many strange features there.
Wow, so you think the sort of the knowledge passed the other way from the UK to people travelling from the East? That's interesting.
Well, John Michell pointed out as well, actually, in one of his, seminal books, stating that, it's not just the root of the New Jerusalem and the root of the first church in Christendom at Glastonbury Abbey has its foundations in Stonehenge.
Wow. What about Alexandria? That was sort of, at this time period, that was sort of one of the main sort of hubs of learning. Do you think there's any sort of Druidic influence at Alexandria at this time period, around the time of Jesus?
Well, the Library of Alexandria was said to be a universal library, and a universal library means it has every single book of the world in it. And I don't think it probably had that. I think by universal library, it meant it had a lot of teachings in it. And because the Druids did not write anything down, they were bardic, learning by word of mouth in effect, then they probably went to the Alexandrian library to practice their teachings to others, because the library wasn't just about reading manuscripts or scrolls or whatever was there. It was a place where people debated. They had philosophical discussions and possibly arguments as well. It was a place of learning, and it was a hub. So you can bet your bottom dollar that the Druids were there just as much as the Egyptians were coming over to Stonehenge, bringing them their beads and their wares. So it's, in the ancient world, there was a lot of exchange of ideas.
Right, so more like a melting pot of learning, rather than I see our education system as being quite rigid and conformist, and this is what you need to learn, and you need to learn it in this particular order, in this particular time of your life, whereas Alexandria would be more of a mishmash, Royal Rumble style, best argument, best evidence wins.
Well, I think it was a place of great learning, where people went to. I mean, even one of the most famous astrologers, Claudius Ptolemy, who wrote Tetrabiblos, a very famous astrological text, still in print today from the 2nd century AD. I mean, goodness, it's one of the most famous books. He learnt astrology from that location in the Alexandrian Library. So, I mean, it was a place where you could go there for mathematics, astrology, geomancy, and probably medicine and numerous other skills alike.
Yeah, there's probably based on, the 7 liberal arts of ancient Greece, sort of roughly, you would have thought.
Well, in all probability, it had, so much going on there. It would have attracted all of the scholars of that known era.
There's a question. I have a listener. Sorry, Ben. That's nearly smashed you in the face with. I got a listener submission question from Kelly, who is a recent producer donator. So I promised I would ask you this question. So this is from Kelly on the Discord. Can you ask Maria? I think it's a 3-part question, so brace yourself, Maria. Can you ask Maria, how can we make our water better at home? Is an imploder good enough? And if so, how do you get or make an imploder? Sounds dangerous to me.
I'd like to know that.
And what is an imploder?
Imploded water is normally programmed in like a kind of spiral vortex coming down. I have one in my home, actually, which I bought from the implosion, company here in the British Isles. I think it's in the South Coast. But what we can do better for our water? Well, our water, as we know, has a lot of chemicals in it. And in water divining terms, you can decode the water through its colour. Pure, really healing water, for example, from Lourdes, fame in France, is going to come up on a colour spectrum in dowsable terms as white. Violet is going to be very holy water, very sacred, very healing, and normal water is blue. So a very simple way of enhancing your water at home is to get a lovely, beautiful shade of blue color. I mean, you could, print it out on your printer, or even get fabric. It's kind of sympathetic magic. So you get the color, and then you place your water that you're going to drink above that. And then because water has memory, water will start to be imbued with that color. And even just by, Emoto showed that just by being harmonic and saying, beautiful words to your water, that, that enhances it as well. So I think we can work with water on many, many different levels, but color coding in old water divining law is probably easy to do, and everybody can do it.
You mentioned that certain water has different colour. I didn't get that. You said like holy water is purple or something. Yeah. I was totally lost on that bit.
No, forgive me. It's probably I didn't explain it that well, so I'll explain it again.
I'm kind of retarded.
No. So thank you for pointing out. Let's say you have a glass of water and you doused it with a colour dial that represents the different frequencies of water. So I've got a pendulum now, and I'm going over the water, and it comes out white on the color dial. It will tell you the different colors, and it comes out white. So that means it's the holiest of waters, like Lord's fame. And if it doused to come out violet, then that's very, very holy water. And if it comes out blue, that's average. That's good water. Don't get me wrong. If it came out red, for example, it's got iron in it. If it comes out green, it's got copper traces in it. And so you can decode water. Most of it is blue. So my point is that if you get blue fabric, or you get a piece of blue colored card, from a craft shop or somewhere, and you place the glass of water or a jug of water, ideally, over that blue color, because the water has a memory, it will start to memorize that color blue, which is more harmonic than just your tap water.
Wow.
Blue coasters,
yeah.
That's a good idea.
There's a market there. Go to the Amish loot chest.
Yeah.
Get your official Amish Inquisition blue coasters.
Yeah, they'll be there next week.
What? I mean, does this apply? Because I remember hearing somewhere that we're like 70% water, us fleshy human type beings. So does this apply to like the water inside you as well?
Absolutely. And a lot of my work with deep underground water, because as an esoteric water diviner, I was always taught there are two types of water. Geologists would disagree. But if we flow with the water divining law, then you have water that comes down from the sky, fills up the water tables and the aquifers. Of course it does. We see that every day of our lives in Great Britain. And that's yang water. That's groundwater, as the water board would call it professionally. But then there's another source of water, very, very deep, a very deep aquifer, that is water that is born by Gaia, by rocks within her being. And that water is the holiest of holiest. And I predict, and I've been saying this for 25 years or more now, that any rock planet can produce water. So you could go to Europa, you could go to Mars, and a planet will produce water. And when it's produced within the body of the planet, it produces a spiral pattern. That's in water divining terms. That's what I would douse. That's what I would understand. It's a spiral pattern. Therefore, it's this deep water. And when we interact with that type of deep water, which the ancients found, and it marked the esoteric center of most ancient sites worldwide. And when you go into that type of energy field, your water, your body water, can interact with that water as well. It's like an energy field. It's like a kind of cleansing, if you will, your body water rather, with the deep water. So it's you can work with ancient sites in that style.
Wow, that's cool. You just got me thinking about. You mentioned other ancient sites. Have you ever been to the Temple Mount and done a bit of dowsing there?
What, in Israel?
Yeah.
No,
I mean, it's like
haven't.
just because it's like the center of like the three big world religions current today. I mean, I guess they're sort of modern in sort of the grand scheme of things. They've only been around a couple of thousand years, or
Young upstarts.
1,500 years in some cases. But I just wondered maybe if there's something there, something at that mountain, deep underground, some sort of aquifer, which has led, these three major religions to sort of fight over that territory since day dot.
Yeah, and you find with spiritual leaders, like Moses and like Isaac, they find springs. It's in their history as well. It's intimately associated with water. The Vatican, for example, intimately associated with lots and lots of springs. And as many Druids, such as the British Druid Order, would say about the Vatican, you get three orders of Druids: the Bards, the Ovates, or Vats, as they used to be called, and Druids. That's the three grades, if you will. And the Vats' main oracle center, their prophecy hill, was the Vatican. And that was taken from the ancient Druids. So we see these places on high as being, associated with prophecies, with springs, with water coming through, because it's the water of life at the end of the day. So I hope that's helped answer Kelly's question.
Oh, she's in the chat now, actually. She said thank you very much.
Yeah, she sent you a green heart.
A green heart? Does that mean she's Irish? A green heart.
I don't know.
Yeah, she's from good Celtic stock. Well, Maria, we've done over an hour already. And, we didn't talk about astrology or much esoterica. It's like, where does the time go?
I know.
Is there anything you want to say before we go? Like, what you've got coming up? Anything you need to tell people about, trips and whatnot?
Yeah, well, what I've got coming up is my first conference at Avebury on September the 3rd and the 4th. I've got a great keynote speaker, Professor Robert Temple, speaking about plasma, your plasma cell and the plasma of the universe. I've got Chris O'Kane as well, who did all of the calculations of the astronomy for Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock.
Cool.
I've got him as well. Yeah, but he's really good. And I've got Daniel Doherty of the best sacred geometrist in the UK as well. He's going to be with me. And I've got Henk Viz, who's the Archdruid of Avebury. And we'll be doing on the first day, on the Saturday, talks and lectures at Avebury. And the second day is coming around the stones with me, Henk, seeing things through the eyes of sacred geometry with Daniel Doherty, and with Henk Viz, Archdruid, and with dowsing and earth energies with little old me. And so, so that's an event coming up. Apart from that, my other events have actually booked up, but that one is out there, and I'd like to meet anybody that's on this podcast that comes out to Avebury. It should be a good weekend. Very informal and very warm.
Yeah, that's good. Sounds cool. I mean, when you mentioned plasma, is it David Temple? Did you say
Professor Robert Temple?
Robert Temple. One of the things I really want to look into is this picture of a man, and he's got his arms up like that. Can you see? I'm small in the screen, and the legs mirror it, and it sort of looks like it's found in ancient sites everywhere, and it sort of looks like a plasma discharge in the atmosphere. Like these ancient guys were encoding this figure that looks like a stick man doing this, when it's actually something they saw in the sky as like a possible bad omen and stuff. Maybe he's going to talk about that, Maria.
Yeah,
Plasma man.
He's definitely going to be talking about the plasma self and how plasma has consciousness. And there's 2 plasma belts between the Earth and the Moon. And he's going to be talking about that as well. So it should be a really informative, but like I say, informal and warm. Because what I want to do with this conference is not to have the audience and the speakers, but to be more one, to more interaction with the two. So there isn't that separation. So that's why I keep saying I want it to be warm and welcoming to everybody, and fun and informative as well.
Sounds great. Check it out. Links in the show notes as ever for all Maria's stuff, and the courses as well from the Esoteric College. Check them out. It's good fun. Learn something while you're doing it.
Absolutely.
Right, we'll sign off for this part. Thanks for joining us again, Maria.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. That was great.
You're welcome.
Yeah. We'll
welcome.
We'll catch you on the flip side. Just stay on the line for us for 2 minutes while we play ourselves out. Sure. And you lot in podcast land, we'll be back in 10-15 minutes for part 2. Okay, take care. Bye. Bye. Bye.